Welcome everyone to another deep dive. Before we even get into the stack of notes in front of us today, I just want to start by offering you a warm divine blessing. May God bless your day and your week ahead. We are so glad you are here with us.
We really are, and we've got a pretty fascinating topic today.
We do. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a historically intense and, frankly, structurally brilliant text, Matthew chapter 23. We are utilizing insights from both the Holman and NAA Study Bibles to really dissect the mechanics of what is happening in this passage.
Right, and setting the scene impartially from the start is it's vital here. What we are looking at through these sources is a detailed historical and textual analysis of Jesus's famous, pretty blistering critique of the religious leaders of his day.
Specifically the scribes and the Pharisees.
Exactly. And the goal for us today isn't to preach to you, but to explore the vivid historical context of first-century Judea, the sharp metaphors used in the text, and the broader, timeless themes of outward hypocrisy versus genuine internal practice.
Yeah, the visual language Jesus uses here is incredibly striking. Even if you aren't a biblical scholar, you've probably heard these phrases. The study Bibles highlight metaphors like swallowing a camel or whitewashing a tomb.
Which are just amazing images.
They really are. They're so vivid, they've actually become part of our modern vocabulary for hypocrisy. But the chapter begins with Jesus addressing the crowds and his disciples, and he points out the seat of Moses. I mean, what does that actually mean in a historical context?
Well, the Holman notes highlight that this wasn't just a figure of speech. Excavations of ancient synagogues have revealed actual, physical, carved stone seats. The leading teacher would sit there to deliver their authoritative interpretation of the Torah.
So it's a literal seat of authority.
Right, and Jesus actually starts by acknowledging their legitimate teaching authority. He tells the crowds to listen to what the scribes and Pharisees teach about the law, but he issues a stark warning not to imitate their actions.
Because they say and do not do.
Exactly. The study notes emphasize that the Pharisees were originally a popular reform movement. Their goal was to make everyday people as pure as the priests serving in the temple. But over time, that noble pursuit of purity morphed into something entirely different.
Something much heavier, right. Because that pursuit is what led to them tying up what the text calls heavy burdens for people to carry. They built a fence around the law.
Yeah, the fence around the law, that's a crucial concept.
For those of you listening who are familiar with ancient legal traditions, this was the practice of creating dozens of extra, highly restrictive rules just to prevent people from even getting close to breaking the actual laws of God.
Right, so if the Torah said not to work on the Sabbath, the fence around the law defined exactly how many footsteps you could take before it was technically considered work.
Which just sounds exhausting.
It was. The intention may have originated from a place of deep reverence for the Torah, but the result became a crushing weight on the common people. The study notes describe this tradition of extra-biblical rules as becoming extremely oppressive.
And the religious leaders tied up these heavy burdens for others to carry, but wouldn't lift a single finger to help them. Then the critique pivots directly from how they burden others to how they visually present themselves to the public.
Yes, the visual presentation, the phylacteries and fringes.
The specific cultural details here are fascinating. Phylacteries, or tefillin, are small leather boxes containing tiny scrolls of scripture worn on the left arm and the forehead.
And fringes, or tzitzit, were tassels with blue cords worn on the corners of garments.
But what stands out in the textual analysis is that Jesus isn't criticizing the wearing of these items themselves. Wearing them was explicitly commanded in the Torah as a physical reminder to obey God's commandments.
The real issue highlighted in the text is that the Pharisees were intentionally enlarging the leather boxes and lengthening the fringes. They were supersizing their religious garments entirely for human eyes.
So it was a calculated effort to look more pious.
Exactly. They wanted to look holy to the people around them. They took a private, physical reminder of a covenant with God and turned it into a public billboard for their own perceived righteousness.
If you think about the modern equivalents you see today, people making sure their charitable giving is highly visible on social media, or loudly broadcasting their moral stances purely for the applause of their peers, it's the exact same performative instinct.
It really is. It's all about social currency.
And the text connects this directly to their behavior at public gatherings. They demanded the best seats at banquets, the front rows in the synagogues, and they relished being greeted with honorific titles in the marketplace. Titles like Rabbi, Father, or Master.
And Jesus responds to this by explicitly forbidding his disciples from using these titles to elevate themselves above one another. He strips away that entire hierarchy.
Emphasizing that they are all brothers.
Right. There is only one true teacher, one guide, and one Father in heaven. He completely upends the social currency of religious status that the establishment of the day was so obsessed with maintaining.
It's interesting how Jesus strips away their social titles in the marketplace, but he doesn't stop there. He takes that critique of their social standing and turns it into a direct legal indictment. We move into what are historically known as the seven woes.
The seven woes. Yeah, this is where the tone really shifts.
If you consider the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, the blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, these woes in Matthew 23 are basically the dark mirror of that sermon. Instead of pronouncements of blessing, they are sharp pronouncements of judgment.
The Greek word used for woe here is we, and it conveys a complex mix of both severe condemnation and a sort of tragic, mournful grief. It's not just anger.
Right, and the first few woes really dig into the absurdity of the legalistic systems they had built.
The sources break down a bizarre, highly complex oath system that the religious leaders had developed. They created a framework full of deliberate loopholes that allowed them to sound completely committed while secretly keeping an escape hatch open.
The mental gymnastics required for their oath system are baffling. According to their rules, if you swore an oath by the temple itself, you weren't bound to it. It meant nothing.
But if you swore by the gold of the temple, suddenly the oath was absolutely binding.
Or if you swore by the altar, it didn't count. But if you swore by the gift resting on the altar, you had to keep your word. It is essentially the ancient codified version of crossing your fingers behind your back while making a promise.
Jesus calls them blind guides for this specific practice because they are entirely missing the foundational logic of their own religion. He points out the backwards nature of their legalism.
It is the temple that makes the gold sacred, right?
Exactly. And the altar that makes the gift sacred, not the other way around. They had placed material value above spiritual reality. They were assigning more sanctity to the gold than to the house of God itself.
This obsession with microscopic legalism perfectly sets up one of the most famous and, frankly, the most humorous analogies in the entire chapter. Jesus tells them that they are straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel.
The study Bibles provide incredible context for this. It is a brilliant piece of hyperbolic stand-up comedy in its original first-century setting.
But you have to understand the ritual purity laws of Leviticus to fully get the joke.
Right. Both gnats and camels were ritually impure animals. Consuming either of them was strictly forbidden.
And the Pharisees were so deeply obsessed with ritual purity that when they drank wine, they would carefully strain it through cloth to ensure they didn't accidentally swallow a microscopic gnat that might have landed in their cup.
Furthermore, the study notes detail how they were meticulously tithing tiny garden herbs like mint, dill, and cumin. They would literally count out every 10th tiny leaf of mint to give to the temple to ensure they were flawlessly executing the law.
While they are pulling out magnifying glasses to tithe their spice rack and straining their wine through cloth, they are completely neglecting what the text calls the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith.
It's a massive blind spot.
For you as the listener, it's easy to see how human nature naturally drifts toward this. It is much easier to count out 10 mint leaves and feel like you've done your religious duty than it is to practice actual justice or show deep mercy to someone who has wronged you.
Jesus points out that ignoring justice, mercy, and faith while meticulously tithing mint is exactly like straining a tiny insect out of your cup and then turning around and gulping down a massive, hairy, spit-covered camel.
The disproportion is supposed to be comical, but the underlying accusation is completely devastating.
They're obsessing over the microscopic details of religious performance while entirely abandoning the massive foundational principles of how to treat human beings.
He stays with this theme of disproportion and outward appearance versus inward reality as the chapter progresses. We get the metaphor of the cup and the plate.
Right. You wouldn't take a dirty, crusted coffee mug, wash only the outside so it looks shiny on your desk, and then pour a drink into it.
The inside is what actually contaminates the beverage. The text accuses the religious leaders of looking incredibly clean and proper on the outside, observing all the rituals, but inwardly they are full of extortion, greed, and self-indulgence.
And that concept of inward contamination leads directly into the strongest visual metaphor in the entire discourse, the whitewashed tombs.
The historical context provided by the study Bibles makes this specific image incredibly rich.
It really does. During the major festivals in Jerusalem, particularly Passover, millions of pilgrims would flood into the city from all over the known world.
And according to the religious law found in Numbers, if a person even accidentally brushed against a grave or a tomb, they became ritually impure for 7 days.
Which is a huge deal for a pilgrim.
Exactly. If you become ritually impure right as you arrive in Jerusalem, you can't participate in the Passover festival. Your entire pilgrimage, which you may have traveled weeks to make, is completely ruined.
To prevent this, the study notes explain that a month before the festival, the locals would go out and paint all the tombs and graves bright white.
This wasn't an aesthetic choice to make the graveyard look pretty. It was the ancient equivalent of bright yellow caution tape.
Yes, it was a glaring warning sign telling pilgrims to keep their distance so they wouldn't be contaminated.
Jesus takes this well-known cultural practice and completely flips it on its head. He tells the Pharisees that they are the whitewashed tombs.
They look beautiful and righteous on the outside to everyone walking by, but inside they're full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness.
The double meaning here is what makes the critique so piercing. He isn't just calling them run-of-the-mill hypocrites who hide their bad behavior.
No, he is saying that their outward appearance of extreme piety is actually a trap. People are drawn to them, thinking they're encountering a source of holiness and guidance, but instead they are encountering spiritual death.
The religious leaders themselves are radiating the very spiritual impurity they claim to be protecting the public from.
To a first-century Pharisee whose entire identity was built on maintaining purity, calling them a source of contamination is the ultimate subversion.
From there, the text moves into the climax of the chapter, and the tone shifts dramatically. The sarcasm and the metaphors drop away, replaced by piercing, direct judgment.
He calls them a brood of vipers and predicts that they will murder the prophets and sages that are sent to them, filling up the measure of their ancestors' guilt.
The text outlines a comprehensive history of violence against God's messengers, stretching from Abel to Zechariah.
By spanning from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, Jesus is using the traditional bookends of the Hebrew Bible to indict their entire history.
Abel's murder is in Genesis, the very first book, and Zechariah's death is recorded in 2 Chronicles, which was the final book in the traditional Hebrew layout of the scriptures.
It is the ancient equivalent of saying from A to Z, encompassing the entire recorded history of innocent bloodshed.
But the sources actually mention a specific textual mystery regarding Zechariah's father here.
Yeah, the NAA Study Bible brings up a fascinating textual detail right here. The Zechariah, who is famously murdered in the courtyard of the temple in 2 Chronicles, is listed there as the son of Jehoiada.
However, the text in Matthew 23 calls him the son of Berechiah.
And Berechiah happens to be the father of the prophet Zechariah, who lived centuries later and authored the book bearing his name toward the end of the Old Testament period.
So the scholars offer several avenues for reconciling this textual discrepancy. One heavily supported theory is that in ancient Jewish genealogies, family names were frequently interchangeable, and it was common to refer to someone by their grandfather's name.
Another well-regarded theory is that this was an early scribal gloss.
Like a copyist made a mistake.
Sort of. An early copyist of Matthew's Gospel may have assumed the text was referring to the famous minor prophet Zechariah and added son of Berechiah into the margins as a helpful note, which eventually was copied into the main body of the text.
That makes a lot of sense. But regardless of whether it's a generational naming convention or a scribal addition, the theological weight of the statement remains unchanged.
Definitely. Jesus is accusing the establishment of perpetuating a continuous, unbroken cycle of violence against those who bring the truth.
But what is truly remarkable about Matthew 23 is the emotional whiplash that occurs immediately after this severe condemnation.
Yeah, the intense woes, the vipers, the history of murder, all of it suddenly gives way to a deeply emotional, almost heartbreaking lament.
Jesus looks over the city and says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing.
For you listening, imagine the shift in the atmosphere there. The righteous anger transitions into raw grief.
And the image of the mother hen is not just a quaint farm analogy.
Not at all. Throughout the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms, the shadow of wings is a recurring, powerful image of Yahweh providing fierce, divine protection to Israel.
So Jesus is taking that divine protective imagery upon himself.
He is. He is expressing a mourning, maternal love for the city, lamenting that they have actively and stubbornly rejected the very shelter that would have saved them from the incoming destruction.
Because of that persistent rejection, there are heavy consequences. The text states, look, Your house is left to you desolate.
The house here primarily refers to the temple in Jerusalem.
And to say it is left desolate means it is abandoned by God's divine presence. The very center of their religious universe is going to be left utterly empty because they missed the reality of what was standing right in front of them.
The chapter concludes by stating they will not see him again until they are ready to welcome the Messiah with the words of Psalm 118, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord."
It is a profound journey through these ancient texts. We move from the critique of performative fringes and exhausting religious loopholes to the unforgettable imagery of straining gnats, swallowing camels, and painting the outside of a tomb while ignoring the decay within.
And it culminated in that poignant lament over a city that refused to be gathered.
It is a lot to process. And the historical depth provided by the study Bibles really brings the first century context to life. It forces you to look beyond the surface of the text.
To leave you with a final thought to mull over, while this text very specifically addresses first-century religious leaders in a specific historical context, it raises a timeless, deeply provocative question for anyone living today.
How so?
Think about it. How often do our modern institutions, whether they are religious, political, corporate, or even our own personal lives, spend absolutely all of their energy painting the outside of the tomb?
Wow. Yeah.
How much effort goes into making the PR, the branding, and the outward appearance look beautiful and pure, while completely ignoring the systemic rot, the lack of mercy, or the absence of justice on the inside? It is a mirror held up to human nature that demands continuous self-reflection.
That brings us to the end of our analysis for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Matthew 23. We hope it gave you some new perspectives to carry with you throughout your week. We're going to sign off for now, but before we go, we want to leave you with this. May God bless all of you listening. See you next time.